Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. I'm Jake. Hope you're well. Tonight we're reading from Sense and Sensibility, chapter 26. So, at least by way of chapter number, we are halfway done. So, let me know if you have whether you're watching live or catching the replay. Let me know if you have any suggestions, right, for the next one. My younger brother and his fiance had their rehearsal dinner this evening, so I just got back from that. So that's exciting, and so I'm a little late, but we're going to do it anyway. We're going to do a little reading of Sense and Sensibility, chapter 26. Excuse me. Chapter 26. Eleanor could not find herself in the carriage with Mrs. Jennings, and Eleanor could not find herself in the carriage with Mrs. Jennings, and beginning a journey to London under her protection and as her guest, without wondering at her own situation, so short had their acquaintance with that lady been, so wholly unsuited were they in age and disposition, and so many had been her objections against such a measure only a few days before. But these objections had all, with that happy ardor of youth which Marianne and her mother equally shared, been overcome or overlooked, and Eleanor, in spite of every occasional doubt of Willoughby's constancy, could not witness the rapture of delightful expectation which filled the whole soul and beamed in the eyes of Marianne, without feeling how blank was her own prospect, how cheerless her own state of mind in the comparison, and how gladly she would engage in the solicitude of Marianne's situation to have the same animating object in view, the same possibility of hope. A very short time, however, must now decide what Willoughby's intentions were. In all probability, he was already in town. Marianne's eagerness to be gone declared her dependence on finding him there, and Eleanor was resolved not only upon gaining every new light as to his character which her own observation or the intelligence of others could give her, but likewise upon watching his behavior to her sister with such zealous attention as to ascertain what he was and what he meant before many meetings had taken place. Should the result of her observations be unfavorable, she was determined at all events to open the eyes of her sister. Should it be otherwise, her exertions would be of a different nature. She must then learn to avoid every selfish comparison and banish every regret which might lessen her satisfaction in the happiness of Marianne. They were 3 days on their journey, and Marianne's behavior as they traveled was a happy specimen of what future complaisance and companionableness to Mrs. Jennings might be expected to be. She sat in silence almost all the way, wrapped in her own meditations, and scarcely ever voluntarily speaking, except when any object of picturesque beauty within their view drew from her an exclamation of delight exclusively addressed to her sister. To atone for this conduct, therefore, Eleanor took immediate possession of the post of civility which she had assigned herself, behaved with the greatest attention to Mrs. Jennings, talked with her, laughed with her, and listened to her whenever she could. And Mrs. Jennings, on her side, treated them both with all possible kindness, was solicitous on every occasion for their ease and enjoyment, and only disturbed that she could not make them choose their own dinners at the inn, nor extort a confession of their preferring salmon to cod or boiled fowls to veal cutlets. They reached town by 3 o'clock the third day, glad to be released after such a long journey from the confinement of a carriage, and ready to enjoy all the luxury of a good fire. The house was handsome and handsomely fitted up, and the young ladies were immediately put in possession of a very comfortable apartment. It had formerly been Charlotte's, and over the mantelpiece still hung a landscape in colored silks of her performance, in proof of her having spent 7 years at a great school in town to some effect. As dinner was not to be ready in less than 2 hours from their arrival, Eleanor determined to employ the interval in writing to her mother and sat down for that purpose. In a few moments, Mary Ann did the same. "I'm writing home, Mary Ann," said Eleanor. "Had you not better defer your letter for a day or two?" "I'm not going to write my mother," replied Mary Ann hastily, as if she was wishing to avoid any further inquiry. Eleanor said no more. It immediately struck her that she must be writing to Willoughby, and the conclusion which as instantly followed was that, however mysteriously they might wish to conduct the affair, they must be engaged. This conviction, though not entirely satisfactory, gave her pleasure, and she continued her letter with greater alacrity. Mary Ann's was finished in a very few minutes. In length, it could be no more than a note. It was then folded up, sealed, and directed with eager rapidity. Eleanor thought she could distinguish a large W in the direction, and no sooner was it complete than Mary Ann, ringing the bell, requested the footman who answered it to get that letter conveyed to her for the twopenny post. This decided the matter at once. Her spirits still continued very high, but there was a flutter in them which prevented their giving much pleasure to her sister, and this agitation increased as the evening drew on. She could scarcely eat any dinner, and when they afterwards returned to the drawing room, seemed anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. Excuse me. Excuse me, sorry. It was a great satisfaction to Eleanor that Mrs. Jennings, by being much engaged in her own room, could see little of what was passing. The tea things were brought in, and already had Mary Ann been disappointed more than once by a rap at the neighboring door, when a loud one was suddenly heard which could not be mistaken for one at any other house. Eleanor felt secure of its announcing Willoughby's approach, and Mary Ann, starting up, moved towards the door. Everything was silent. This could not be borne many seconds. She opened the door, advanced a few steps towards the stairs, and after listening half a minute, returned to the room in all the agitation which a conviction of having heard him would naturally produce. In the ecstasy of her feeling at that instant, she could not help exclaiming, "Oh, Eleanor, it's Willoughby, indeed it is," and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms when Colonel Brandon appeared. It was too great a shock to be borne with calmness, and she immediately left the room. Eleanor was disappointed too, but at the same time her regard for Colonel Brandon ensured his welcome with her, and she felt particularly hurt that a man so partial to her sister should perceive that she experienced nothing but grief and disappointment in seeing him. She instantly saw that it was not unnoticed by him, that he even observed Mary Ann as she quitted the room with such astonishment and concern as hardly left him the recollection of what civility demanded towards herself. "Is your sister ill?" said he. Eleanor answered in some distress that she was, and then talked of headaches, low spirits, and over fatigues, and of everything to which she could decently attribute her sister's behavior. He heard her with the most earnest attention, and seeming to recollect himself, said no more on the subject, and began directly to speak of his pleasure at seeing him in London, making the usual inquiries about the journey and the friends they had left behind. In this calm kind of way, with very little interest on either side, they continued to talk, but both of them out of spirits, and the thoughts of both engaged elsewhere. Eleanor wished very much to ask whether Willoughby were then in town, but she was afraid of giving him pain by any inquiry after his arrival, and at length, by way of saying something, she asked if he had been in London ever since she had seen him last. "Yes," he replied with some embarrassment, "almost ever since. I've been once or twice at Delaford for a few days, but it's never been in my power to return to Barton." This, and the manner in which it was said, immediately brought back to her remembrance all the circumstances of his quitting that place, with the uneasiness and suspicions they had caused to Mrs. Jennings, and she was fearful that her question had implied much more curiosity on the subject than she had ever felt. Mrs. Jennings came in. "Oh, Colonel," said she, with her usual with her usual noisy cheerfulness. "I am monstrous glad to see you. Sorry I couldn't come before. Beg your pardon. But I've been forced to look about me a little and settle my matters, for it's a long while since I've been at home. And you know one has always one has always a world of little odd things to do after one has been away for any time. And then I have had Cartwright to settle with. Lord, I've been busy as a bee ever since dinner. But pray, Colonel Brandon, how came you to conjure out that I should be in town today?" "I had the pleasure of hearing it at Mr. Palmer's, where I've been dining." "Oh, you did? Well, and how do they do at their house? How does Charlotte do? I warrant you she is a fine size by this time." "Mrs. Palmer appeared quite well, and I'm commissioned to tell you that you'll certainly see her tomorrow." "Oh, to be sure, I thought as much. Well, Colonel, I have brought two young ladies with me, you see. That is, you see but one of them now, but there's another one somewhere. Your friend, Miss Mary Ann, too, which you'll not be sorry to hear. I will, your friend, Miss Mary Ann, too, which you'll not be sorry to hear. I don't know what you and Mr. Willoughby will do. I don't know what you and Mr. Willoughby will do between you about her. Oh, it's a fine thing to be young and handsome. Well, I was young once, but I was never handsome. Worse luck for me. Anyway, however, I got a very good husband, and I don't know what the greatest beauty can do more. Ah, poor man, he's been dead these 8 years and better. But Colonel, where have you been to where have you been since we parted? How's your business going on? Come, come, let's have no secrets among friends." He replied with his customary mildness to all her inquiries, without satisfying her in any. Eleanor now began to make the tea, and Marianne was obliged to reappear again. After her entrance, Colonel Brandon became more thoughtful and silent than he had been before, and Mrs. Jennings could not prevail on him to stay long. No other visitor appeared that evening, and the ladies were unanimous in agreeing to go to bed early. Marianne rose the next morning with recovered spirits and happy looks. The disappointment of the evening before seemed forgotten in the expectation of what was to happen that day. They had not long finished their breakfast before Mrs. Palmer's barouche stopped at the door. They had not long finished their breakfast before Mrs. Palmer's barouche stopped at the door, and in a few minutes she came laughing into the room, so delighted to see them all that it was hard to say whether she received most pleasure from meeting her mother or the Miss Dashwoods again. So surprised at their coming to town, though it was what she had rather expected all along, so angry at their accepting her mother's invitation after having declined her own, though at the same time she would never have forgiven them if they had not come. "Mr. Palmer will be so happy to see you," said she. "What do you think he said when he heard of your coming with Mamma? I forgot what it was now, but it was something so droll." After an hour or two in what her mother called comfortable chat, excuse me, or in other words, in every variety of inquiry concerning all their acquaintance on Mrs. Jennings' side, and in laughter without cause on Mrs. Palmer's, it was proposed by the latter that they should all accompany her to some shops where she had business that morning, to which Mrs. Jennings and Eleanor readily consented, as having likewise some purchases to make themselves, and Marianne, though declining it at first, was induced to go likewise. Wherever they went, she was evidently always on the watch. In Bond Street, especially, where much of their business lay, her eyes were in constant inquiry, and in whatever shop the party were engaged, and in whatever, and in whatever, sorry, and in whatever shop the party were engaged, her mind was equally abstracted from everything actually before him, from all that interested and occupied the others. Restless and dissatisfied everywhere, her sister could never obtain her opinion of any article of purchase, however it might equally concern them both. She received no pleasure from anything, was only impatient to be at home again, and could with difficulty govern her vexation at the tediousness of Mrs. Palmer, whose eye was caught by every pretty thing, expensive or new, who was wild to buy it all, could determine on none, and dawdled away her time in rapture and indecision. It was late in the morning before they returned home, and no sooner had they entered the house than Marianne flew eagerly upstairs, and when Eleanor followed, she found her turning from the table with a sorrowful countenance which declared that no Willoughby had been there. Has no letter been left here for me since we went out? She asked the footman, who then entered with the parcels. She was answered in the negative. Are you quite sure of it? She replied. Are you certain that no servant, no porter has left any letter or note? The man replied that none had. How very odd, she said, in low in a low and disappointed voice as she turned away to the window. How odd indeed, repeated Eleanor within herself, regarding her sister with uneasiness. If she had not known him to be in town, she would have written to him. She would not have written to him as she did. She would have written to Combe Magna. But if he's in town, how odd that he should neither come nor write. Oh, my dear mother, you must be wrong in permitting an engagement between a daughter so young, a man so little known, to be carried on in so doubtful, so mysterious a manner. I long to inquire, and how will my interference be borne? She determined after some excuse me. She determined after some consideration that if appearances continued many days longer as unpleasant as they were now, she would represent in the strongest manner to their mother the necessity of some serious inquiry into the affair. She would represent in the strongest manner to her mother the necessity of some serious inquiry into the affair. Mrs. Palmer and the two elderly ladies of Mrs. Jennings' intimate acquaintance, when she had met and invited them to dinner, when she had met and invited in the morning, whom she had met and invited in the morning, dined with them. The former left them soon after tea to fulfill her evening engagements, and Eleanor was obliged to assist in making a whist table for the others. Marianne was of no use on these occasions, as she would never learn the game, but though her time was therefore at her own disposal, the evening was by no means more productive of pleasure to her than to Eleanor, for it was spent in all the anxiety of expectation and the pain of disappointment. She sometimes endeavored for a few minutes to read, but the book was soon thrown aside, and she returned to the more interesting employment of walking backwards and forwards across the room, pausing for a moment whenever she came to the window, in hopes of distinguishing the long-expected rap. That was chapter 26. Hey, what's going on? It has been a while. Good to see you. Hope school and work is going along there. Yeah, so I don't remember the last time you were in here, but we've done hey Lee, good to see you. We have done The Wind in the Willows, Persuasion, working on Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, and this one, Sense and Sensibility. So, yeah, we're getting the old ball team back together. Good to see everybody in here. Been about 5 months. Okay, so see, we're halfway done with Sense and Sensibility. We've done the what do you call it? The Wind in the Willows, and I forget what else. But yeah, been doing a lot of stuff. Yeah, man, it's been staying pretty busy on here. Okay, so let's do we'll do one more chapter. Chapter 27. Chapter 27. If this open weather holds much longer, said Mrs. Jennings, when they met at breakfast the following morning, Sir John will not like leaving Barton next week. 'Tis a sad thing for sportsmen to lose a day's pleasure. Poor souls, I always pity 'em when they do. They seem to take it so much to heart. That is true, cried Marianne in a cheerful voice, and walking to the window as she spoke to examine the day. I had not thought of that. This weather will keep many sportsmen in their country. It was a lucky recollection. All her good spirits were restored by it. It's charming weather for 'em indeed, she continued as she sat down to the breakfast table with a happy countenance. How much they must enjoy it! But, with a little return of anxiety, it cannot be expected to last long. At this time of year, and after such a series of rain, we shall certainly have very little more of it. Frosts will soon set in all probability with severity. In another day or two, perhaps, this extreme mildness can hardly last longer. Nay, perhaps it may freeze tonight. At any rate, said Eleanor, wishing to prevent Mrs. Jennings from seeing her sister's thoughts as clearly as she could, I dare say we shall have Sir John and Lady Middleton in town by the end of next week. Oh, my dear, I'll warrant you we do. Mary always has her own way. And now, silently conjectured Eleanor, she will write to Combe by this day's post. But if she did, the letter was written and sent away with a privacy which eluded all her watchfulness to ascertain the fact. Whatever the truth of it might be, and as far as Eleanor was from feeling thorough contentment about it, yet while she saw Marianne in spirits, she could not be very uncomfortable herself. And Marianne was in spirits, happy in the mildness of the weather, and still happier in her expectation of a frost. The morning was chiefly spent in leaving cards at the houses of Mrs. Jennings' acquaintance to inform them of her being in town, and Marianne was all the time busy in observing the direction of the wind, watching the variations of the sky, and imagining an alteration in the air. Don't you find it colder than it was this morning, Eleanor? There seems to me a very decided difference. I can hardly keep my hands warm even in my muff. It was not so yesterday, I think. The clouds seem parting, too. The sun will be out in a moment, and we shall have a clear afternoon. Eleanor was alternately diverted and pained, but Marianne persevered, and saw every night in the brightness of the fire, and every morning in the appearance of the atmosphere, the certain symptoms of approaching frost. The Miss Dashwoods had no greater reason to be dissatisfied with Mrs. Jennings' style of living and set of acquaintance than with her behavior to themselves, which was invariably kind. Everything in her household arrangements was conducted on the most liberal plan, and excepting a few old city friends, whom, to Lady Middleton's regret, she had never dropped, she visited no one to whom an introduction could at all discompose the feelings of her young companions. Pleased to find herself more comfortably situated in that particular than she had expected, Eleanor was very willing to compound for the want of much real enjoyment from any of their evening parties, which, whether at home or abroad, formed only for cards, could have little to amuse her. Colonel Brandon, who had a general invitation to the house, was with them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Eleanor, and who often derived more satisfaction from conversing with him than from any other daily occurrence, but who saw at the same time with much concern his continued regard for her sister. She feared it was a strengthening regard. It grieved her to see the earnestness with which he often watched Marianne, and his spirits were certainly worse than when at Barton. About a week after their arrival, it became certain that Willoughby was also arrived. His card was on the table when they came in from the morning's drive. "Good God!" cried Marianne. He's been here while we're out." Eleanor rejoiced to be assured of his being in London. Now ventured to say, "Depend upon it, he will call again tomorrow." But Marianne seemed hardly to hear, and on Mrs. Jennings' entrance, escaped with the precious card. This event, while it raised the spirits of Eleanor, restored to those of her sister all, and more than all, their former agitation. From this moment her mind was never quiet. The expectation of seeing him every hour of the day made her unfit for anything. She insisted on being left behind the next morning when the others went out. Eleanor's thoughts were full of what might be passing in Berkeley Street during their absence. But a moment's glance at her sister when they returned was enough to inform her that Willoughby had paid no second visit there. A note was just then brought in and laid on the table. "For me!" cried Marianne, stepping hastily forward. "No, ma'am, for my mistress." But Marianne, not convinced, took it up instantly. "It is indeed for Mrs. Jennings. How provoking!" "You're expecting a letter, then?" said Eleanor, unable to be longer silent. Yes, a little, not much. After a short pause, you have no confidence in me, Marianne. Nay, Eleanor, this re- Nay, Eleanor, this reproach from you, you who have no confidence in no one, you who have confidence in no one. Me, returned Eleanor in some confusion. Indeed, Marianne, I have nothing to tell. Nor I, answered Marianne with energy. Our situations then are alike. We have neither of us anything to tell. You because you do not communicate, and I because I conceal nothing. Eleanor, distressed by this charge of reserve in herself, which she was not at liberty to do away, knew not how, under such circumstances, to press for greater openness in Marianne. When Mrs. Jennings soon appeared, and the note being given her, she read it aloud. It was from Lady Middleton, announcing their arrival in Conduit Street the night before, and requesting the company of her mother and cousins the following evening. Business on Sir John's part, and a violent cold on her own, prevented their calling in Berkeley Street. The invitation was accepted, but when the hour of appointment drew near, necessary as it was in common civility to Mrs. Jennings that they should both attend her on such a visit, Eleanor had Eleanor had some difficulty in persuading her sister to go, for still she had seen nothing of Willoughby, and therefore was not more indisposed for amusement abroad unwilling to risk the than unwilling to risk than unwilling to run the risk of his calling again in her absence. Eleanor found, when the evening was over, that disposition is not materially altered by a change of abode, for although scarcely settled in town, Sir John had contrived to collect around him nearly 20 young people, and to amuse them with a ball. This was an affair, however, of which Lady Middleton did not approve. In the country, an unpremeditated dance was very allowable. But in London, where the reputation of elegance was more important and less easily attained, it was risking too much for the gratification of a few girls to have it known that Lady Middleton had given a small dance of 8 or 9 couple, with 2 violins and a mere sideboard collation. Mr. and Mrs. Palmer were of the party. From the former, whom they had not seen before their arrival in town, as he was careful to avoid the appearance of any attention to his mother-in-law, and therefore never came near, they received no mark of recognition on their entrance. He looked at them slightly, without seeming to know who they were, and merely nodded at Mrs. Jennings from the other side of the room. Marianne gave one glance round the apartment as she entered. It was enough. He was not there, and she sat down, equally ill disposed to receive or communicate pleasure. After they had been assembled about an hour, Mr. Palmer sauntered toward the Miss Dashwoods to express his surprise on seeing them in town, though Colonel Brandon had been first informed of their arrival at his house, and he had himself said something very droll on hearing that they were to come. "I thought you were both in Devonshire," said he. "Did you?" replied Eleanor. "When do you go back again?" "I don't know," and thus ended their discourse. Never had Marianne been so unwilling to dance in her life as she had been. Never had Marianne been so unwilling to dance in her life as she was that evening, and never so much fatigued by the exercise. She complained of it as they returned to Berkeley Street. "Ay, ay," said Mrs. Jennings, "we know the reason of all that very well. If a certain person, who shall be nameless, had been there, you know you would not have been a bit tired. And to say the truth, it was not very pretty of him not to give you the meeting when he was invited." "Invited!" cried Marianne. "So my daughter Middleton told me, for it seems Sir John met him somewhere in the street this morning." Marianne said no more, but looked exceedingly hurt. Impatient in this situation to be doing something that might lead to her sister's relief, Eleanor resolved to write the next morning to her mother, and hoped, by awakening her fears for the health of Marianne, to procure those inquiries which had been so long delayed. And she was still more eagerly bent on this measure by perceiving their breakfast on the morrow that Marianne was again writing to Willoughby, for she could not suppose it to be any other person. About the middle of the day, Mrs. Jennings went out by herself on business, and Eleanor began her letter directly, while Mary Ann, too restless for employment, too anxious for conversation, walked from one window to the other, or sat down by the fire in melancholy meditation. Eleanor was very earnest in her application to her mother, relating all that had passed, her suspicions of Willoughby's inconstancy, urging her by every plea of duty and affection to demand from Mary Ann an account of her real situation with respect to him. Her letter was scarcely finished when a rap foretold a visitor, and Colonel Brandon was announced. Mary Ann, who had seen him from the window and who hated company of any kind, left the room before he entered it. He looked more than usually grave, and though expressing satisfaction at finding Miss Dashwood alone, as if he had somewhat in particular to tell her, sat for some time without saying a word. Eleanor, persuaded that he had some communication to make in which her sister was concerned, impatiently expected its opening. Excuse me. Eleanor, persuaded that he had some communication to make in which her sister was concerned, impatiently expected its opening. It was not the first time of her feeling the same kind of conviction, for more than once before, beginning with the observation of "Your sister looks unwell today," or "Your sister seems out of spirits," he appeared on the point either of disclosing or of inquiring something particular about her. After a pause of several minutes, their silence was broken by his asking her in a voice of some agitation when he was to congratulate her on the acquisition of a brother. Eleanor was not prepared for such a question, and having no answer ready, was obliged to adopt the simple and common expedient of asking what he meant. He tried to smile as he replied, Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known." "It cannot be generally known," returned Eleanor, "for her own family do not know it." He looked surprised, and said, "I beg your pardon. I'm afraid my inquiry's been impertinent. But I had not supposed any secrecy intended, as they openly correspond, and their marriage is universally talked of." "How can that be? By whom can you have heard it mentioned?" "By many, by some of whom you know nothing, by others with whom you are most intimate. Mrs. Jennings, Mrs. Palmer, and the Middletons. But still I might not have believed it, for where the mind is perhaps rather unwilling to be convinced, it will always find something to support its doubts. If I had not, when the servant let me in today, accidentally seen a letter in his hand, directed to Mr. Willoughby in your sister's writing. I came to inquire, but I was convinced before I could ask the question. Is everything finally settled? Is it impossible to... But I have no right, and I could have no chance of succeeding. Excuse me, Miss Dashwood, I believe I've been wrong in saying so much, but I hardly know what to do, and on your prudence I have the strongest dependence. Tell me that it's all absolutely resolved on. That any attempt, that in short concealment, if concealment be possible, is all that remains." These words, which conveyed to Eleanor a direct avowal of his love for her sister, affected her very much. She was not immediately able to say anything, and even when her spirits were recovered, she debated for a short time on the answer it would be most proper to give. The real state of things between Willoughby and her sister was so little known to herself that in endeavoring to explain it, she might be as liable to say too much as too little. Yet she was convinced that Mary Ann's affection for Willoughby could leave no hope of Colonel Brandon's success, whatever the event of that affection might be, and at the same time wished to shield her conduct from censure. She thought it most prudent and kind, after some consideration, to say more than she really knew or believed. She acknowledged, therefore, that though she had never been informed by themselves of the terms on which they stood with each other, of their mutual affection, she had no doubt, and of their correspondence she was not astonished to hear. He listened to her with silent attention, and on her ceasing to speak, rose directly from his seat, and after And after saying in a voice of emotion, "Your To your sister, I wish all imaginable happiness. To Willoughby, that he may endeavor to deserve her," then took leave and went away. Eleanor derived no comfortable feeling from this conversation to lessen the uneasiness of her mind on other points. She was left, on the contrary, with a melancholy impression of Colonel Brandon's unhappiness, and was prevented even from wishing it removed by her anxiety from that very extent, by her anxiety for the very event that must confirm it. That was chapter, what do you call it? Lena, what's going on? That was chapter 27. So tonight, I some of my brothers are getting together because our little brother's getting married tomorrow. So I'm supposed to go over to my mom's house and gonna have coffee and talk and such. So I'm about to head over there. So I'm gonna cut it a little short tonight, 2 chapters, but we'll be back at it. If not tomorrow night, definitely I plan on Sunday night through all next week, and we might be finished with this book by next week. Also, The Wind in the Willows, the full audiobook, is about to be posted because I've just edited it. I finished it today. I'm putting it up there. So if you like The Wind in the Willows, Mr. Toad is one of my very favorite characters in literature that I've ever read, and I'm so excited to post this. And I hope that you like Mr. Toad as much as I do, and my my telling of the story. I hope you enjoy it. So anyway, definitely check that out if you like good literature. So thank you very much for watching. If you are live or catching the replay, I hope you'll subscribe and hit the old like button. And thank you very much for hanging out. Lena, that is great to hear. I'm really glad you're enjoying it. Yeah, I love Persuasion, and I'll put Wind in the Willows into the full audiobooks playlist, and then of course Sense and Sensibility will be up there soon too. So anyway, y'all have a wonderful evening, and I will talk to y'all very soon.